welcome to my channel, Graniteville Vajra Temple. Today we will continue exploring Gulf history, Al-Khalij. Things are getting heated there, so without further ado, I would like to introduce to you today's book written by Dr. Johan Mathew of Rutgers University. His book, Margins of the Market, Trafficking and Capitalism Across the Arabian Sea, published in 2016, traced the hidden networks that traffic slaves, guns, and gold across the Arabian Sea in the late 19th and early 20th century. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day to all those in America. It is MLK Day, and we are in Eastern Standard Time, January 15th, Monday, Om Namah Shivaya. Page 91 of this book. By the first decade of the 20th century, British officials could only pressure the Arab rulers of the Gulf to prohibit the export of guns to Iran or India. Fun fact, the foreign diplomat Jay Shankar is going to visit Iran very soon. It is on his schedule. So let's see if they can finally figure something out, because this situation ain't sustainable, yo. Weapons were still imported into these territories, but at least they could not be legally exported to regions where they might endanger British rule. Subsequently, British diplomatic efforts slowly pushed to monitor and then closed the coasts of the Arabian Sea to the importation of precision rifles. The preservation of property rights around the Arabian Sea would depend on effective control over these borders. However, pivotal gaps at Muscat and Djibouti frustrated this cordon sanitaire along the littoral. So, Djibouti is on the Horn of Africa, bordering the Red Sea, and it is one of the main ports of Ethiopia to the ocean. However, there are too many foreign agents there, so they're making a deal with Somaliland. And for some reason, I wrote Texas, New York City, Somaliland on one of these paintings in my living room, and I don't remember what I was thinking. Anyways, Somaliland does not actually have that much say in the UN. I don't even know if it's in the UN, but I did meet somebody working for the UN while I was in Djibouti. The office to Somaliland sent by the UN, and he was like a Chilean Finnish dude. I forgot his name. But, these things, it's just so interesting, now, because everyone wants passage. Everyone wants safe passage. And the sheikh ain't got time for nobody. The sheikh's not bothering any negotiations before this Israel-Palestine issue is solved, right? So people are just trying to scramble and find their own deals. And Somalia is we don't want Ethiopia to recognize Somaliland, even though the UN has had something there for some time. Anyways. Back to the book. So the main character that this guy focuses on is this trader called Ratansi Purushottam, who has all these firms and capital across the Indian Ocean. So he follows what he's trying to do. In 1906, Ratansi Purushottam was filled with anxiety over what might be occurring at yet another conference of colonial powers meeting in Brussels. Failing to regulate the arms trade in 1890, and again missing the mark with the capture of the SS Balochistan in 1898, colonial bureaucrats gathered once more in 1906 to find a way to enforce their sovereign rights. By the way, I'm getting all these cruise ads. Who wants to go on a cruise when the whole sea is at war right now? Maybe that particular place is particularly under conflict, but in general, it's you could have advertised it a bit earlier. This is bad timing. The conference discussed ways to limit the arms trade in Asia and Africa, and there were indications that the delegates would institute a ban on the export of arms to Muscat. Schwarze and Hammer, one of Ratansi Purushottam's trading partners in London, was not particularly concerned. They insisted that even if a ban was instituted, they would merely deliver a large number of small shipments to comply with the restrictions. In small enough consignments, Shorta and Hammer did not have to report their transactions, and custom officials could not possibly monitor every little shipment that passed through the docks. A small number of consignments of firearms consequently did not constitute an arms trade. Customs officials were very concerned about the threat that firearms posed to the security of property rights. However, regulation required economies of scale. Small customs establishments could only monitor commodities that were concentrated in sufficient numbers. An arms trade could be supervised, but a trickle of weapons seeping through the customs house was almost impossible to trace and thus was written off as insignificant. Systems of surveillance and rubrics of classification were developed to distinguish a threatening trade from a negligible trickle. What amount of goods constituted a significant trade? What routes of transport were used by legitimate traders? And what methods of exchange opened the possibility of an illicit trade? Colonial officials developed strategies to make the arms trade visible, and mercantile networks developed tactics to subvert these regimes of classification. Not quite trading. Arms regulations were intended to constrain a substantial trade that might threaten private property and the state's monopoly on violence. So from the earliest arms regulations in the 1870s, traffickers imported firearms into British India in small lots, and colonial officials were mostly oblivious. By the 1890s, British administrators were struggling to understand how significant numbers of arms ended up in prohibited areas in the absence of an observable arms trade. One official came to a seemingly contradictory conclusion. Quote, I am not of the opinion that there is a regular direct trade, but at the same time there is most probably a steady flow of arms into Afghanistan from the country below, meaning, I guess, British India? What persisted into the middle of the 20th century, despite all efforts to stop it, was a trickle or the importation of arms in driblets. One merchant in Bombay shipped a large amount of sulfur for making gunpowder in 270 lots of exactly 10 seers. One seer equivalent to 10 kg approximately, 10 kilograms approximately. 10 seers was the limit beyond which sulfur had to be declared in custom forms. So in this way, the merchant avoided customs and licensing regulations and could deny engaging in ammunition trade. He's just importing sulfur so the sadhus can use it to make mercury, right? That's me. Increased transportation costs were balanced by the invisibility of not quite engaging in trade. Colonial regulations define trade not just by quantity, but also by trajectory. If merchants did not engage in wholesale trade and merely facilitated arms imports for a licensed consumer, they were not regulated as traders. Merchants facilitating such imports did not need a trading license, and European consumers could even claim a rebate on import duties. What? Such firearms were required for the self-defense and personal use of Europeans and other loyal subjects of the British Empire. These weapons were ostensibly imported for the protection of property, so the British administration had hoped that granting rebates would steer weapons into the hands of loyal subjects and property owners. But rather than protecting property and securing colonial rule, this policy merely illustrated the ignorance of the administration. Alarming numbers of weapons were being imported for which no rebate was claimed, and officials could only conclude that these were ending up in the hands of unlicensed consumers. What appeared to be individual direct consignments was ultimately revealed as a cunningly designed wholesale trade in arms. Regulators also confronted the problem that in frontier areas, arms regulations appeared to promote theft and raiding. Bandits and thieves easily obtained weapons through illicit methods, while law-abiding subjects could not obtain firearms for self-protection and found themselves defenseless against criminals. Thus, local officials, overwhelmed by the depredations of the criminal classes, criminal classes, pleaded for a more liberal interpretation of arms trafficking regulations. Quote, "It is impossible to deprive the criminal classes of arms. They can procure them for purposes of aggression without the least difficulty. To refuse arms to the more respectable headmen or chiefs is therefore to place them at the mercy of the dangerous classes. In districts where dacoity, meaning banditry, is common, the people should be encouraged to defend themselves. I have known more than one instance in which an attack on a village has been defeated by a show of resistance and a few matchlocks being fired off from the interior of the houses." End quote. Colonial bureaucrats' efforts to disarm the population actually made subjects more vulnerable to violence than they had been previously. Disarmament was so all-encompassing that peasants were increasingly subject to attacks by wild animals that damaged their crops. The inability of the colonial bureaucracy to protect property from the violence of criminals or animals meant that officials had to backtrack and more liberally interpret the provisions of arms regulations. Similarly, concessions were made on the waters encircling the Arabian Peninsula, where maritime raids continued to afflict trade. When 2 dhows were plundered off the coast of Aden in quick succession, the senior naval officer questioned the ability of the Royal Navy to protect British-registered vessels. Shout out Navy SEALs. He even suggested that Imperial administration should provide Martini Henry rifles and ammunition to dhow captains at cost price so that they would be able to protect themselves. But inevitably, this concession opened up another avenue for the illicit trade in firearms. Dhow captains, like small ships, dhows. Dhow captains realized that rifles permitted for self-defense could provide a profitable addition to their regular trade. Colonial authorities were unable to secure the property rights of their subjects and consequently permitted them to arm themselves. Much to their chagrin, officials found that self-defense just as quickly became an opening for an illicit arms trade and only perpetuated the insecurity of property rights. Small consignments of firearms and ammunition continued to be a remarkably effective method of circumventing restrictions on an arms trade. Flexible trading. Custom authorities had to accept that a trickle of firearms would still flow into their territory, but they hoped to ensure the validity of these transactions by constraining the routes through which the traffic flowed. Regulators tried to identify consumers and register all the intermediary transactions in order to map out exactly how the arms traffic was operating. Sounds friggin' impossible. By the way, I knew this PhD person, he gave up his studies because his racist advisor didn't want him to graduate. He was working on arms trade in Africa, and it was also very eye-opening in terms of how far the colonial reach went when it came to, controlling the means of violence. The need for economies of scale required that legitimate trade be routed through major hubs. Customs authorities ordered that all arms intended for the western Indian coast be funneled through Bombay, where transactions could be more easily monitored. I finished this book while I was in Mumbai. It was like such a sobering, look into the universe. I was like, why is Mumbai running around, looking for opportunities all the time when people should just settle down? And it's like, no, it does not sleep. The city does not sleep. Yet entrepot like Bombay and Zanzibar on the coast of East Africa were brought under increasing scrutiny from colonial regulations. Yeah, so this guy was also researching on, I think, like how guns entered Africa through the East African side, not the West African side. Trafficking networks shifted their operations to Muscat. Muscat had the perfect infrastructure to mediate the licit and illicit components of the arms trade in the Arabian Sea. The Sultan of Muscat lightly taxed imports and did not monitor exports, and his long and loosely governed coastline made it easy for firearms to be surreptitiously sent to consumers as close as Bandar Abbas and as far away as Somalia. So Oman is right next to Yemen in the map, and they are both south of the country that currently, doesn't really know what it is. As a result, Muscat became the premier arms trafficking hub in the Arabian Sea. This, of course, antagonized imperial officials who redoubled their efforts to impose the same standards of transparency in Muscat. The Sultan of Muscat resisted British pressure until 1912, when his growing debts left him no choice but to comply. A licensing and warehousing system was put in place that minutely scrutinized the quantities of weapons and ammunition purchased by each individual consumer. The bottleneck created by this new regulatory system created ferocious resentment among the Omani tribes of Muscat's hinterland. These angry consumers subsequently rallied behind a rival to the Busaidi dynasty and almost deposed the Sultan. While there were other grievances behind the revolt, arguably the major driver was the imposition of the arms warehouse at Muscat. Thus, arms regulations intended to secure the state's monopoly on violence almost caused the destruction of the state. Well, the tribes are basically the political rulers, so I don't know why this guy is making it sound so serious. British warships propped up the Sultan's rule, but Muscat's role as a trading hub was devastated, as were the profits of firms like Ratansi Purushottam, the Indian trader. Yet, even as Muscat's arms traffic declined, many merchants shifted their operations to Kuwait, Djibouti, and the Omani port of Sur. So I once had a friend who lived in Sur, and he would, video chat me and take drugs. That's just the situation of Sur. And then he would judge other Arabs for doing other things that he considered haram. And I'm just like, why are you guys judging each other? Like, y'all are just like, the same. Anyway, Sur, shout out Sur. Kuwait's rise as an arms trading hub was subsequently constrained by British pressure to stamp all imported arms with the wasam, or family emblem of the sheikh. This limited the re-export market and the resale value of these weapons. Yet once again, the arms traffic adapted, and until World War II, Qatar would take up the mantle of arms trading. Qatar! The ease with which arms trading networks shifted from one port to another reflects how arms regulations diverted trade flows without actually disciplining them. Even those traffickers who could not hop from one accommodating port to another found other ways of evading the gaze of custom authorities. The wholesale trade particularly concerned British officials because it was so opaque. This reminds me of one meme online. I don't know if you guys saw it. It was like, the international regulatory regime tells Japan stop exporting cars to ISIS, and Japan's just like, who's doing that? I don't know. None of us. And cars just end up from Japan into Syria and Turkey disputed borders. Anyways. Customs officials subjected these dealers to rigorous surveillance in order to render the trade more transparent. But rather than comply with demands for transparency, arms traffickers used vague terms in their documentation, like a gang. Ratansi Purushottam's cargo on the SS Baluchistan was consigned to order rather than to a specific purchaser. Wow. So if I ordered guns from this guy, I would just be consigning something. Imperial authorities assumed that this vague designation was proof of the shipper's intent to engage in illicit sales. British, Indian, and Arab shippers all responded that local consumers would not pay for a weapon they could not visually inspect. And if they took possession of the weapon before paying, consumers would never actually pay. Moreover, merchants needed to keep goods in their own name for the duration of a journey in order to secure financing and insurance. So why did the Life of Pi not have any guns on board to shoot the tiger? Anyways, Ratan C. Purushottam then was prosecuted fundamentally for trading methods that accommodated the exigencies of local trade. Other traffickers took the more blatant step of consigning their goods to fictitious firms or falsely consigning goods to reputable firms whose names would forestall suspicion. Merchants also frequently exercised the option to alter the port of consignment mid-journey in order to take advantage of price fluctuations at different ports. Imperial bureaucrats imagined that trade was a pre-planned process. Shippers countered that trade was unpredictable. And that they had to constantly adapt to shifting markers. Surveillance was not a neutral activity. It involved the diversion, concentration, and reordering of trade flows. Not only were the Indian imports channeled through Bombay, but Bombay arms dealers were required to keep government-issued account books, detailed records of their transactions in English, and to make these records available for periodic inspection. Yeah, I was eating at the Yacht. There's this resto club in Mumbai called the Yacht that legally sells alcohol to restaurant patrons. And the boss had this huge account book. And I guess it's the same for alcohol. It's like you have to write it in a very specific format. Otherwise, the government's going to take your license away. Shout out the Yacht Resto Club. Very nice place to eat. These regulations reformatted the smallest details of transactions in order to make them visible. So these efforts pushed traders into more overtly illicit activities and had the perverse effect of skewing what meager information was already available. The political agent in Kutch complained, quote, to require retail dealers to keep books might so impede sales of licensed imports that smuggling would take place and that the present information as to the quantity of caps, a type of ammunition, entering Kutch would become less reliable, end quote. Much as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle suggested for electrons, the act of identifying the routes through which firearms flowed made it impossible to ascertain the quantities flowing through these routes and vice versa. Regulation did not facilitate legitimate trade. It staunched the flow of legitimate trade by increasing the transaction costs and reducing the flexibility of traders. Merchants moved instead into illicit trading or to transactions far removed from what imperial bureaucrats conceived of as trade. Attempts to make arms traffics more transparent actually resulted in their becoming more opaque. Ratan C. Purushottam repeatedly requested that their Belgian-manufactured rifles be inscribed with the phrase "Made in England" rather than "Made in Belgium." The manufacturer could not comply with this request. So Purushottam asked that they simply leave out any indication of the place of manufacture. The compromise was finally reached that the Belgian proof marks would be on the underside of the barrel so that it did not show, and that the shipment would go directly from Antwerp to Muscat and hence avoid British customs and the application of the Merchandise Marks Act, which prohibited such a practice. Ratan C. Purushottam never put much effort into obtaining British rifles. Indeed, they were focused on Belgian and German manufacturers.
Why were they so anxious to give the impression that these rifles were in fact manufactured in British land?
To be continued. Thanks for watching.